Okay, so today I'm going to go over the endocrine system. Again, this is going to be just a basic overview of everything. I'm going to hit a lot of topics that we are going to be doing in class. I'm going to expect that you know majority of the stuff I'm going to go over here anyway, so this should be just a review. So I'm going to highlight some things. I'm going to talk about things that are going to be important for the future and what you need to know for the test coming up. But again, this is going to be a basic review. So when we're talking about this, pituitary gland, thyroid gland, parathyroid glands, adrenal glands, pineal gland, pancreas, and then how those kind of patterns work together, and the whole process of how the body regulates itself. So when we're looking over this, how it works is through hormones, which are basically chemical messengers that are going through the bloodstream. Now they can be free floating in the bloodstream to hit the target cells, or they can go inside the cells to work into specific aspects inside the cells, like the nucleus or the mitochondria, and they can also attach to proteins to transport around. 3 different types of hormones that are out there: amino acid derivatives, peptide hormones, and lipid derivatives, which are going to be mostly our steroids and our cyanoids. Again, not too important that you know all this stuff right now, but we are going to go into details with this later. So again, just being a rough review, and they're going to work onto receptor sites. So the hormones will bind to those receptors and give whatever function we need to do, whether it's a positive or a negative feedback, or what that receptor is, how the hormone works on it. And again, most of these receptors are going to be on cell membranes, on organs, on different aspects, but some of them are going to be inside the cells, and these hormones are going to basically diffuse into the cell to work on those. The body basically does a secretion of the hormones, and it releases in the blood supply. Some of these are going to be free-floating constantly out there. Some of them are going to be attached to the transport proteins like I talked about. And then the other aspect of regulation is we need aspects to inactivate those freely circulating hormones and take them out of distribution. Because we're going to secrete hormones. I'm going to give you, for example, adrenaline. When we do adrenaline, it's going to be a short rush. We're going to secrete it out there, then we're going to absorb it, stop secreting anymore, and get those free-floating ones out of the system and stop the function we're looking to do. So that's how the body's going to regulate itself. When we deal with steroids and other thyroid hormones, those, because they attach to a protein, they're going to last in the system. They're a lot harder to break down, and especially when we're dealing with synthetic steroids. We have long-acting, short-acting. It's all in the binding process so that it can get the regulation we're looking for out of them. Different type of ways that we're going to see this. We have a liquid stimuli, what we call the humoral, and that's going to be coming through the blood. Hormonal stimuli, which are going to affect the production, and then neural stimuli, where we get nerve impulses and tissues to stimulate that. It's all how the body regulates. So there's one main component called the hypothalamus. It's in the brain, and it works on our whole system of the endocrine system regulation. This is the highest level of endocrine control. So the hypothalamus regulates everything in the body. It's the most important link, and it's the link between the nervous system and the endocrine system and how it takes all that information in. So very important concept to know. The hypothalamus is what controls our whole endocrine regulation. So now let's talk about all the glands that are going in there. Pituitary gland is, again, one of the most important ones that we're going to deal with. It has direct communication with the hypothalamus, and it secretes 9 different hormones. Of those 9 hormones, they're not only going to work onto the body, but they're going to work on other glands and cause secretion of hormones, steroids, and that's going to be our main aspect of control. So pituitary, very important. Here's kind of a diagram of where it's located. It's in a bony cavity in the sphenoid bone. So the sphenoid bone, as you guys know from skeletal, is directly behind the eye sockets and directly on the brain. If you can see the picture here, you can see the location. The hypothalamus is right here, kind of deals with the cerebral cortex area, and then it comes down and works on the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is protected in this bone. Again, very thin bone, but it's in a protected area. So as we look into it, the pituitary gland can be divided into 2 chambers, an anterior chamber and a posterior chamber. And I'm going to see here if I can go on here. So we have the anterior chamber here. I'm going to pan. So the anterior chamber is here. Posterior chamber is here. And the posterior chamber also acts on the hypothalamus. So anterior chamber basically accounts for 7 of the 9 different hormones. This is going to be most of our endocrine cells right here that's going to produce it, and it's a highly vascular area with capillaries so it can flow in the bloodstream and get out to the body. The posterior aspect then is going to deal with the other 2 hormones. And this basically has some direct neurostimulation up on the hypothalamus for the hypothalamus to produce the 2 main hormones, which is ADH and oxytocin. Again, I'm not going to have you know too much right now of knowing what 7 is produced by the anterior and what are the 2 by the posterior, but as we get more into the renal area in the kidneys, ADH is going to be a huge component we're going to deal with, and same with oxytocin. So I'm not going to hold you to where these hormones are right now, but those are going to be important aspects of how we deal with things later. So I will know that's on future areas. Today, again, an overview. Portal systems, again, this is the area right here. We talk about the portal, and this is the access to basically we get blood supply, blood flow, and neural connections between 2 areas. It's as complex as I'm going to get over right now. As far as our hypothalamic control on the anterior pituitary portion, the hypothalamus will act on the anterior gland with 2 type of hormones, and it's very simple, it's straightforward, it's in their name. The releasing hormones, and obviously if it acts on it with releasing hormone, it wants it to release hormones. Or 2, it's going to be inhibiting hormones. And vice versa there, we're talking about we want to inhibit the release of those hormones. So that's our feedback loop, and that's what acts from the hypothalamus down onto the pituitary gland, specifically the pituitary anterior component. The 7 hormones that it does produce: thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, which is going to go down on our adrenal glands and talk about those further down in this lecture. Gonadotropins, which are going to work on the gonads, 2 different types. Specifically, we're going to deal with our follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. We'll get more of those specifically later when we're talking about reproductive system as well. Prolactin and melanocytic stimulating hormone, which is going to work mostly when we're talking about the pineal gland, is where that'll be working on. The posterior pituitary gland, again, this is those axons that go back on and acts back onto the hypothalamus through nerve responses, and that causes the release of ADH, antidiuretic hormone, which is going to be a huge component when we're dealing with the blood pressure regulation, and oxytocin. The thyroid gland, okay, this is going to be a small gland that's going to be right below the thyroid cartilage and cricoid cartilage. Thyroid cartilage right here, cricoid cartilage right here. And the important aspect that we need to know with this is this specific area right here when we're dealing with surgical airways. So right here is the thymus gland. It just sits right over the area. It's a very fatty, soft tissue kind of area. There's 2 main lobes that are located on either aspects, here, and then a small isthmus in the middle that connects those 2. When we're dealing with those, basically what we've got in these thyroid areas, it has these epithelial cells, and it comes around here, and these endocrine cells produce the hormones. Those hormones get stayed right here in this thyroid follicle, and they get stored up so that they can be released. These C cells, and all I'm going to go from here, we'll go more detail later, it's going to be what's helping regulate and control the production of these hormones that are going to be stored in this thyroid follicles. Different thyroid hormones that are going to be dealing is tyrosine is going to be the main function, and that's going to be thyroxine and triodoxythyronine. Those are going to be 2 main components. I'm not going to go over any of those details right now. We will go those later. This is going to be a huge component when we deal with thyroid storm and other thyroid conditions that people have and how it affects the body. These thyroid hormones, when they do produce, these are ones that actually cross the cell membrane and will go in, and they work specifically on the mitochondria and on the nucleus to make changes. So here's a receptor site, cell that we're going to. The cytoplasma is the material inside. That thyroid hormone here will actually cross the barrier, come down, and act directly on the nucleus, or specifically it'll go to the mitochondria. And what it does on the mitochondria is this is where the Krebs cycle occurs. So it's going to increase the mitochondria reactions to help produce more ATP. So those are the main functions where it's going to be focusing on. And I just kind of covered that right here. Other aspects it's going to do is by increasing our metabolic rate. It increases our metabolic rate by working on the mitochondria. It gets more heat generated, increases our body temperature. So it's going to be very important with thyroid follicle hormones and those to increase the production and development of our skeletal system, the muscular system, and the nervous system. So if we have a problem of overproducing thyroid hormones, our skeletal system will increase in size. Our muscles will increase exponentially. The nervous system can grow. So it actually can cause some extra problems, and we'll talk about those. And same with underproduction. Is going to cause some serious growth problems and metabolic problems as well. Another aspect, though, if we do get overproduction, that we'll look on is if we get overproduction but we have a decreased amount of iodine in the system, those cells can't produce in the thyroid. So it starts producing even more cells, but these cells, because it doesn't have iodine, aren't able to synthesize steroid hormone. So they just become basically increased tissue mass. So increased thyroid follicles in tissues, but no hormones into it, basically develops this large mass along the neck, which we basically call to a goiter. So that's where we have issues there, and we need to control our releasing hormones and our inhibiting hormones to help keep that all in regulation. So this kind of shows you if you get something out of whack, out of check, these are some things that conditions that develop, and when you see someone with a goiter, you know they're going to have thyroid issues that need to be controlled. The C cells in the thyroid gland, again, I'll be not going over these as much right now. Big thing is its release of calcitonin, and calcitonin regulates the concentration of calcium ions in the body. This will be a huge factor when we're dealing with skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, any muscle area at all, because it regulates how much calcium. Calcium is one of the important ions out there besides sodium, potassium, magnesium. Calcium, again, we talked about, sits in the sarcoplasmic reticulum. When you release calcium into the area, it binds to troponin. That allows muscle contraction. If you don't have calcium in the system, you aren't going to get muscle contraction. It's not going to work very well. On the other side, you have too much calcium in there. It's not being controlled. You can get muscle contractions that you're not looking for. Here basically is going to really prove that point. What happens when we die? Well, when we die, the body is no longer functioning. It opens up all the valves, and sodium is allowed to cross the membranes regularly because there's no control of that. Sodium comes in, what does it do? Well, sodium causes the release of calcium into the sarcoplasmic reticulum out into the area so it combines with troponin. Once it binds with troponin, it opens up that the myosin head and the actin molecules attach. They contract. Now you've got no regulation to pump out that sodium, so calcium doesn't get resorbed, so those muscles stay contracted as long as the body is still producing energy. It's using its stores, its glycogen stores, its creatine stores, and those last bits of energy is basically holding those binding sites open and the calcium in there. Well, what is that, or what do we see? That's called rigor mortis. That's the tightening aspect. Once the reserves are all used up and all the energy is used up, then calcium basically floats throughout the body, can no longer hold the binding of the head, and then the body eventually will go into a more flaccid state. But that's how we see, and one of the things we see with that contracted state. We're also going to see that in a condition we'll talk in cardiology later called stone heart, the exact same type of thing with the muscle. We get excessive amount of calcium. We aren't able to regulate that area and get the calcium out. The muscle actually contracts and stays contracted even in the heart, and it gets what we call a stone heart, where it just stays completely contracted and you can't get it to a relaxed state. Obviously, that's going to cause problems. So some things for the future that we're going to go over, but I want you to get those basics, and this is why AMP is so important to know how these medications work and what needs to be done so you can figure out how you're going to treat them and how the medications. If you're going to give a medication, you got to know what it's going to do. Again, calcium we talked about there, so it's going to affect how the muscles go into spasm, convulsions, everything like that, basically by the control. So along the thyroid gland, what also works on it was called the parathyroid gland. There's actually two per each lobe that sit here and here. So each side has its own parathyroid glands on it there. And these are going to help also regulate. It has two main cells. The chief cells produce parathyroid hormone, and the other cell type are unknown. So again, it just shows us in medicine how we really don't know how completely the body works. We're still trying to figure out. We're always learning in medicine. So here we've got a cell type has a function that no one quite knows what it does yet. So just kind of shows you where things are. So the chief cells basically secrete parathyroid hormone or parathormone. PTH, parathyroid hormone, works for me as far as notifying that. Again, for this, not that important. But the parathyroid's main function is to regulate calcium, keep that in the body. So how do we get calcium when we don't have reserves and we don't have intake of it? Well, we have osteoclasts that are going to break down our bone. Our bone releases calcium. So it's going to stimulate our osteoclasts, break down that bone. And when it's breaking down bone, it's breaking down what? It's breaking down the osteocyte, the main portion. What builds back up bone? Our osteoblasts. Well, we don't want to take that calcium that's being broken down and use it because we need it in the body system. So our osteoblasts get inhibited. So now we're not building bone. So we're actually weakening bone. And then we're also going to reduce the amount of excretion of calcium on the kidneys. So we're going to affect the loop of Henle. I'll have to get more in detail of those, but we're going to affect holding calcium instead of secreting it out when we see that excess. So our body can utilize those. This is also another important aspect when we're talking about pregnancies and dealing with prenatal care. Again, you need to have calcium in the system. What used to happen before prenatal care was out there, what would happen for a lot of women is the baby would need the calcium, and it basically takes from the mother anything it needs. So you'd see the mother have really bad teeth because it would pull calcium from the teeth, from the bones, very weak bone structures. If there was not good intake of calcium, vitamin D, all these type of things, women could actually die during pregnancy because their body was so weakened and that they couldn't survive those areas. Their bones would break. A lot of different things could happen because the function of the baby is more priority for that area. So we'll get into this more detail when we get into labor and delivery and more into that aspect. Other aspects the parathyroid works on, it stimulates the kidneys. Again, this is going to be for the main control of calcium. So here's that stimulation. So if we have falling levels of calcium in the blood, it's going to stimulate the parathyroid, and it's going to come just like I said. And it's going to work on the osteoclast stimulation, inhibition of osteoblasts. We're going to reabsorb calcium in the kidneys, and then we're going to get calcitrol, which is going to basically enhance the calcium absorption in the digestive tract so we can get more of it. All that's going to go to increase the levels of blood calcium. Once that come back and we get homeostasis restored, then it's not going to stimulate the parathyroid gland, and then we get back to the normal production. So that's the flow of what we're going to see. The adrenal glands, again, these are going to be right on top of the kidneys, also known as the suprarenal gland, renal being referred to kidney and supra being superior to. So this is going to work specifically on the kidney. It does work on the body. Main production is going to be out of the adrenal cortex or the adrenal medulla. Cortex being the outside, medulla being the inside, and its pretty much function is to stimulate activity, metabolism, whole function on there. It's about 20 different steroids that it actually produces and releases. Our important ones that we're going to be talking about in maintaining this is going to be towards our fight or flight. So adrenal gland, what does it produce? Adrenaline. We also know it as epi, and then we have norepinephrine. Are going to be our two main ones that we'll be functioning on. I'm not going to go into the specific aspect of these corticosteroids and the regions that it works on, but this gives you a little glimpse. We'll go into that more detail later. Another couple of areas it's going to work on aldosterone. Aldosterone and ADH are all going to be on the functions and very important when we're dealing with blood pressure maintaining. It's going to respond to our mineralocorticoids to sodium content. So again, I talked about calcium being an important ion. Sodium is going to be another one. Potassium levels. So this are all going to be directions our kidney and affect those areas. That's why when we talk about people on dialysis having a lot of problems because they can't control the levels of potassium or sodium. So it's going to affect how their muscle contracts, how their heart works. These are all huge components that you have to understand. And we'll deal with those more later. But this is, again, like I said, a review. Glucocorticoids are also going to be in here. And these are going to basically affect our glucose metabolism. Why is this important? Well, because of all the diabetics we see. So you have to understand how the medications work, what's going on. It's going to affect cortisol, which cortisol is going to be basically storing glucose, corticosterone, and cortisone, all different aspects that are going to be doing from the aspect of glucose metabolism, whether it's breaking it down or whether it's storing it as in fats or glycogen, and how those stores work. So the glucose corticoids basically are going to regulate that, and basically through sensory aspects decide whether we need more glucose or we need less. They also work on an anti-inflammatory response. I'm not going to go over that right now. We also have our sex hormones that released in there. Both our works on the adrenal medulla that contains the epinephrine or adrenaline we talked about, and the norepi. These are going to be two big components with a fight or flight response, and dealing with stimulation on the heart as well as metabolism. So with these, we're looking at inotropic, chronotropic, and dronotropic responses. I'm not going to go over those right now, but those are going to be a big part when we deal with cardiology and how we're maintaining the contractility on the heart. And then they're going to work basically on our sympathetic system, because that's our fight or flight. Our parasympathetic system is going to be the exact opposite. So once those are taken down. So these are going to trigger the release of energy. So we're going to break down our glycogen reserves, and our corticosteroids are going to come in there and work on our creatine breakdown as well and produce ATP. That gets us our muscular power so we can be completely active. It's going to shut down our digestive processes, and it's going to basically get our body ready to move quickly. It's also going to work on our heart. This is where I talked about the inotropic, dromotropic, and chronotropic responses. The pineal gland is a small gland up in the brain. It works on the ventricle systems, which I'm not holding you guys accountable right now, but it's up in the brain, works on the third ventricle, and this is the synthesis of melatonin. This works on the basal gland, works on the whole body. This regulates our main aspect of homeostasis, especially with inhibition of reproductive functions. It's our antioxidants and doing those, and establish of our circadian rhythms, basically knowing when it's day or night. Pancreas is going to be a huge aspect for us as well, because of, like we talked about, all our diabetic patients that we're going to see. This regulates our main hormones, dealing with blood glucose. It's located right below the stomach, attached by the small intestine of the duodenum, and it's going to basically secrete into there as well as into the blood supply. Its main two hormones that we're going to discuss are glucagon and insulin, and those are our major regulatory effects of blood glucose. Glucagon is going to help break down glycogen storage or produce increased levels of blood glucose into the blood vessels, where insulin is going to take those blood glucose levels and store it back into either fat or glucagon, and take it out of the bloodstream. So the main component of the pancreas is we're talking about the islets of Langerhans. That's the main component cell. Inside there, this is the main functional unit as we talk about. The osteon is the main functional unit of bone. The myofibril is the main functional unit of skeletal system. The islets of Langerhans is the main functional component of the pancreas. And it's acted on by these exocrine cells around the area. On the islets of Langerhans, there's basically three types of cells that are there. I'm going to go over alpha and beta. There's also delta cells there as well. The alpha cells produce glucagon. Beta cells secrete insulin. Important to know these testing wise. So easy way to remember is alphabetical: A before B, G before I. So alpha, glucagon, beta, insulin. We'll talk more about too when we're getting into other aspects of how this works with diabetics type 1, diabetic type 2, and how those work. But beta cells are the insulin and how those regulate the body's blood glucose. So as we look on this area here, if we get high levels of blood glucose, it's going to act on the beta cells because those secrete insulin. And insulin is going to basically incorporate removing blood glucose and storing it into the body. When blood glucose concentrations decline, that's going to come work on here. Now we're going to stimulate what cells? should be the alpha cells. We're going to stimulate the production of glucagon to come then break down the stars. And that's, again, how the body recreates homeostasis and keeps everything in balance. So it's be a combination and flow of how much blood glucose is actually floating around from periods of time when we're eating and not. And that's what this is going to talk about here, just what I mentioned on there. So I'm skipping through these slides. And here's the exact opposite of declining of how it works on the alpha cells that we just discussed. The other aspect of blood glucose is going to work on our autonomic system, which is which system? If you remember from neurology, our autonomic system, this is going to be our somatic system working with our viscerals, because this is automatic. We have no control over those. This is going to have our parasympathetic stimulation and sympathetic stimulation. So parasympathetic, this is our feed and breed, if you will. So we want to have insulin release because this is we're going to be eating, digesting, and reducing activity. Sympathetic stimulation is our fight or flight. So there we want to inhibit and decrease digestive period. So we're going to decrease or inhibit insulin release, and we're going to promote glucagon release to break up those stores and produce energy. All right, so the endocrine system works on multiple different organ systems and tissues. So we're going to be working on digestive system, the kidneys, the heart, the thymus, gonads, and the reproductive system, all these different things that we were just talking about. Big aspect that I want you to know when we're dealing with the kidneys, we're going to be basically used, and we'll go into more detail later with this, but working on the different hormones that will act on the kidney. Calcitrol, again, inhibiting the release of calcium and retaining more peptide hormones with erythropoietin and building up or increasing blood supply and promotion of increasing blood cells. Renin, working on the system for blood pressure. Angiotensin and aldosterone, basically working on the kidneys to retain or restrict salts and water loss to increase blood pressure, and vice versa. When blood pressure gets high, how it's going to work there. It's going to stimulate the heart, as we talked about, the cardiac muscle, and how to regulate the strength of contraction. And then also dealing with the blood pressure of putting back pressure against the heart to push against. I talked a little bit about the thymus and location and the hormones that are there. The gonads, basically the testes and the ovaries. The testes basically producing, obviously, testosterone. Very simple on that one, where our ovaries are going to be producing estrogen. And progesterone are going to be our two main ones working with stimulation. Again, I'm going to go over more of these when we're dealing with the labor and delivery portion and reproductive cycle. We're also going to work on adipose tissue and the hormones there. I'm not going to hold you responsible for these. And we're going to have basically an interaction of the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. We have an antagonistic effect, very simple. It's going to be working against each other, and we're going to have a synergistic effects where the hormones are going to be working together to accomplish the same type of thing. That's basically is about as intense as I want to get in as far as those areas. All these aspects are going to work on the body, from growth hormones, stimulating hormones, get the body to continually grow and maintain. Again, the whole function is to keep that function to be working toward homeostasis and balancing. If we get too little of growth hormone secreted, we're going to get what we call dwarfism, or your body's not going to produce. Whereas if we get oversecretion, we're going to get gigantism, and we'll talk more about those later in the third module. Talked enough about insulin and parathyroid. So that's about, again, all I'm going to do for today for a review. Is going to cover these areas. We will get into, again, and we talk in the third module, how we get thyroid storm and an imbalance of hormones and what that does to the body and what we can do to fix it, at least recognizing those symptoms, because some of these things, obviously, we're not going to be able to fix in the field. And And again, I'm going to skip to most of this stuff because we'll talk some of these in the renal system, and the rest of them we're going to get more out when we get more into the third module. Again, basic review, I'm not going to hold this for the test on from here. And you will have access for the actual course. You'll have access to every single one of these slides. So I'm just basically going briefly over that. So that's it for today on the endocrine system. Hopefully it was helpful. Please let me know if you have any questions.